On Saturday, March 1st, I'll be hosting an online event titled Dancing with Darkness, a virtual descent into the vital mystery of light and shadow. Originally set to open with a storyteller, the event has shifted slightly. We will now begin with a bit of an extended live conversation instead between myself and Samuel Adams, who will be featured in an upcoming episode of the project. This will be followed by 2 visionary talks from past guests of the project, Ganga Devi Braun and Daje Alo. Though slightly shorter than originally planned, this gathering remains a rich opportunity for meaningful exploration around a vast and important theme. Together we will journey through the life-giving dance of light and shadow, offering reverent reflections, soulful stories, stirring insights, and interactive Q&A sessions where you can engage directly with the themes explored. A recording will be available with every ticket purchase, allowing you to revisit the content at any time. So follow the link in the show notes to learn more about the event, and I hope that you will join us for this virtual descent into the vital mystery of light and shadow. Welcome to Wild Heart Revival, a gathering place for heartfelt conversations and stories as pathways of renewal and revival. I'm your host, Tay Tayari, and today's guest is Kalah Hill. Kalah invites us to explore the vital force of pleasure, its power to heal, liberate, and connect. As she shares some of her journey of reclaiming agency, choice, and responsibility in the realms of intimacy and desire, we dive into various themes such as freedom, love, and erotic healing. Kalah reveals how pleasure, woven into our being from the beginning, serves as both a healing force and an act of resistance. She reminds us that love is liberation and liberation is love, inviting us to reclaim our pleasure and reconnect with Eros, the vitality of life. Pleasure is an invitation to wholeness, a resilient thread binding us to life's beauty. Through Eros, love, connection, joy, we return to our deepest belonging, alive, awake, and free. Erotic healer, heart tender, and pleasure activist, Kalah Hill is the founder of In Pleasure We Trust. She believes that affirming and integrating pleasure leads to freedom and sovereignty within our shared interdependence. As a guide of equanimity, truth, and solidarity, she helps decalcify the heart and use Eros as a healing salve for deeper connection. With 15 years of experience, she brings care and rootedness to her work, supporting clients in embracing the erotic and sensorial. She's currently based in Mexico City and travels to New York and Europe frequently. To find out more about her and her background, as well as her services, follow her on Instagram and check out her website, both found in the show notes. If you're new to the show, you might like to know that I'm a counseling psychologist with an online practice dedicated to supporting wanderers, wanderers, and edgewalkers. I offer individual, couples, and group counsel, as well as support around death and dying. To learn more, visit my website through the link in the show notes. And know that I also offer free insight calls. This provides a risk-free opportunity for us to connect, explore our alignment, and determine if we're a good fit to walk alongside each other during a pivotal time in your life. And I'm generally open to connecting via video chat if you feel naturally drawn to do so, whether for guidance, curiosity, collaboration, or any other meaningful reason. So feel free to reach out at any time. You can also find my email in the show notes. And if you haven't yet, I invite you to subscribe to Wild Heart Revival on your preferred podcast platform, and know that your likes, comments, ratings, and shares are not only deeply appreciated, but that they are also vital for supporting the organic growth of these heartfelt conversations and stories. Now, let's warmly welcome Kalah as we give ourselves and each other permission to somatically and meaningfully explore why reclaiming pleasure matters and how it might take shape for us.
So I know that this is changing for you now, which makes the question even more interesting to me, because as you describe on your website, you're a freedom doula, a pleasure activist. And so I'd love to hear from you what freedom and pleasure activism means at this precarious and precious time in human Earth history, and how that, maybe even how that's changed for you and how it's changing for you at this time.
Thank you. Yeah, so I always joke, I'm like, my middle name should be Freedom, because it is a core value that just lives and breathes and never dies in me. It's just forever present. And freedom to me is the great medicine of love, really. To me, it's like the closest essence or action to love. Like, love is liberation, and liberation is love. And so over the last 7 years of my work and my practice, I've really been incorporating freedom as a main ingredient to what I offer. And I will continue to do that for the rest of my life, again, because it's my middle name, should be my middle name. And what I've also found inside liberation and inside pleasure is similar to me. Pleasure is this deep well of satisfaction and satiation where one can reside in their being in complete release, right? Like where you completely surrender. Pleasure allows that. Pleasure gives permission to that complete surrender. Because when we are in the depths of our pleasure, we are in the depths of our release and satiation. So it's like you're marinating in this like ooey gooey delicious honey, almost. Like that's like the visual I get of pleasure. And so those two things combined and really worked over the last 7 years in my craft have led me now to kind of, this new title or archetype of healer. So I'm seeing that both liberation and pleasure are healing modalities. That they heal and they orchestrate this reverence for the wound and the wounding that we have in our culture, in our society, in our bodies, in our hearts, in our minds, and to heal those aspects through the erotic. So erotic healer is one of my new titles, as well as heart tender, because I see that as I work with the medicine of Eros, as I work with liberation and pleasure, it really seeps into the heart space. The heart starts to reveal itself. And it starts to really open up these tendrils of deep, deep care, like deep nourishment, deep care. And yeah, so heart tender and erotic healer are kind of like these new thread lines. I haven't even added it to my website or anything because I'm still kind of working with it. But every time I speak to it, like the fire inside of me rises and like my hands get super hot. And that to me is an indicator of alchemy and change. So yeah, I'm in that process right now.
Yeah, beautiful. I'm so happy to hear that there's a fire being stoked within you in this time of change, and claiming a kind of a new title, a new way of walking your path. I'd love to talk more about Eros and erotic healing, but I'd like to, before going there, just talk a bit more about pleasure, and particularly like the barriers to pleasure, So many of us have inherited cultural and ancestral stories that distance us from pleasure. Often it can be casted as indulgent or insignificant or even destructive. And so, what perspectives have been most informative or transformative for you in reclaiming pleasure as a truly sacred natural force, especially when those narratives feel deeply entrenched?
Mhm. Yeah. We could talk for hours about this one.
Yeah.
So, pleasure is an impeccable power source. And I think that's why it has been oppressed, suppressed, manipulated, um, and really, I'd say irresponsibly held. So,
Mm.
the power that lies within each and every one of us, each and every being, plant, object on this earthly plane that we know, resides, in so much innate and inherent power. So for me, pleasure is something that is inherent to our human being. You can see it in babies, right? Like babies, they'll start smiling and laughing before they crawl or talk or anything, right? There's this inherent joy, this inherent pleasure that is weaved through the tapestry of our gene code. And
Mm.
that's not just like by happenstance. There's evolutionary biology, there's scientific data, there's neuroscience that really supports the claim of like our inheritancy around this and the significance of pleasure as a tapestry in who we are. And so that alone gives me enough permission to move towards pleasure without any sort of guilt or shame or hesitancy. Now, I know that for some people it's like, well, there's a lot more cultural indoctrination, Kayla, that's taken place, by the church and state, and by the societal frameworks that we live inside. So a part of my work definitely speaks to unraveling those thread lines and belief systems, stories, narratives that we have around pleasure, and whether or not they're true, and if they are serving us. Because guess what? We actually choose the story. We
Mm.
actually get to choose our narrative. We actually get to write and create and craft the script of our lives. And so I really help people understand that you get to define pleasure for yourself. Pleasure doesn't define you, right? So
Mm.
it's like this reclamation of agency, choice, accountability, responsibility. I am a recovering addict. I've been sober for almost 6 years now. Woo.
Oh, good for you.
So I definitely understand indulgence, and I
Mm.
understand how destructive it can become. It was a personal journey for me to reclaim pleasure as a practice of health, as a practice of healing, as a practice of abundant prosperity and regenerative power. And I had to transmute a lot of that in my own belief system around pleasure and where the source of it came from, instead of it being an externalized source, like, oh, this like craft beer that I'm going to drink like 7 of, or like this,
Mm.
high sugar candy, whatever it might have been that I was like reaching for outside. I learned how to cultivate an internal knowing of pleasure that was sourced from within, that came from the inside out instead of the outside in, trying to fill some sort of void, whereas the void was really a longing for me to return to myself and to return to my inherent knowing, that is oh so pleasurable. So yeah, there's other things I could say, but
Yeah. Well, so good for you for being sober for 6 years, and for that to be not a turning away from necessarily, but a turning toward and incorporating, not turning away from pleasure, but turning toward it and really getting clear on what is it really. And so let's talk a bit more about that. Like, what is it really? You're talking about it rising from deep within.
Mm-hmm.
You connected it to your own inner knowing.
Yes.
Tell us more.
So it's natural, like, and so much of it, like for me, I go to my child self. I go to a younger version of myself because it's a little bit more accessible, because children are so free in so many ways, and they have so much more access than most of us do to their somatic being and to the resonancy of their felt experience. So I always go back to childhood, and I kind of remember like how curious I was, how open and available I was to following my pleasure and my joy, and what sparked kind of interest, right? And this is the thing with pleasure, is that it's a catalyzer in awakening the senses. It's very sensorial. And so I remember just exploring in the woods. I grew up in upstate New York, and I would just explore through the woods like for hours as a kid. Like I would and I would touch things, and I would taste things, and I would it was very sensory and very erotic. Eros has been over sexualized. Pleasure has been over sexualized. People go straight to genitalia, and it's like, well, that is an aspect of the work. Yes, of course. And who doesn't like great lovemaking? And there is a infinite, abundant realm in which pleasure resides that is way beyond sexuality. And it goes into kind of the life force energy that is the experience of a sensorial moment. So as a child, I was just so available for those moments. Like I had almost no hesitation around enjoying myself. Like that wasn't even like a concept, And so just allowing myself to go back to those memories was really helpful. And then instilling certain practices that would almost like bring those experiences back to me. So making sure I spent time in nature again, because that was like a big piece of my childhood exploration around pleasure. I loved it. I loved being in the woods. I loved all the critters and creatures. I loved animals so much, and I was very drawn to the animal kingdom and biology and ecology. And I actually went to graduate school for marine biology, and so I do hold a master's in marine biology as well.
Wow.
And I allow myself to remember my belonging to the ecology of this world, of these ecosystems that I belong to. Not that like I'm separate from, but like I inherently know and remember. And so that childlike curiosity is one way to kind of lead yourself towards a remembrance of your pleasure. And it's a great starting point.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to talk about this, the ecology of pleasure. And you were mentioning at the beginning that it's inherent through ecology, through all living beings. And I wonder what your take is on like what the ecological function of it is. I'm hearing that, and I agree with this, that it's a way of and is it the chicken or the egg kind of thing? Like, does pleasure come from being sensorily awake and connected to the immediate moment? Or is it the other way around? I don't think there's that either one's the answer, right? But that being inhabiting the sensational is essential for pleasure to be present. So then it makes me think that part of the ecological function of pleasure would be to have us enjoy paying attention, to enjoy receiving information, to be to feel enticed, drawn into the living moment, so as to participate more fully. But I'd love to hear your take on it.
Yeah. It is the point of conception. I mean, if you think about the ethers of human conception and other forms of procreation, the ethers in which that the embryo of you, the embryo of me was materially manifested, was inside the ethers of an erotic experience. Now, whether our parents were embodied or not, is another story. But the essence of every conception is an essence of erotic nature and pleasure. Now, so I would say the survival of the species is where it fits in.
Right.
Of
course.
So that's just ground zero. Real kind of like none of us would be here if it wasn't for pleasure and for Eros. So
but there's something, I agree.
Yeah.
At the same rate, there's something like I've watched nature documentaries and have watched other species having sex, and oftentimes it doesn't look like a very pleasurable time, right? It can be forceful, it can be very short-lived. So there is something about humanity's capacity for pleasure that, like, I agree that's ground zero. But I just wanted to like kind of expand on like the capacity for pleasure that we have is profound,
Yeah.
and there's got to be an intelligence in that it's not just this carnal satisfaction. There's some deeply intelligent weaving happening in an earthly way through us, through our pleasure.
Yeah. It's definitely resilient, like I think about just all the pain and suffering and hardship and just really hard shit that people have to go through, and how pleasure brings in a remedy. It brings in a solve for getting through this thing called life together. And those bonds and connections that are made from pleasure sustain us. They sustain cultures, they sustain communities, they sustain families, they sustain friendships, partnerships. It is a bond that is incredibly trustworthy when felt in integrity, when accessed from a place of true respect and responsibility and care. Pleasure is a remedy. It's a healing balm. And I think that it serves humanity very well when used under those contexts and prescribed from that place of intentionality.
Yeah, that was so well said. Yeah. Let's talk about pain a little bit more, because it's very fascinating, the interplay between pain and pleasure. Not only that that pleasure is a remedy for pain, but that for some folks, pain can actually be transmuted into pleasure. So there's this very rich, deeply entangled, fascinating relationship between pain and pleasure. And I'd like to just hear you jam on that a little bit.
Yeah, so here's my science nerd again.
Great, great.
So the neurobiology shows that when we experience pain, the same area of the brain lights up as when we experience pleasure. So I'm not sure the exact area of the brain that it is. I didn't go that deep because that was enough information for me to trust that pain and pleasure are these like significant partners, and that they really work with one another. And you can see this in various sex positive communities around BDSM and kink, for example, when you're working with high impact play, where you are imposing, quite high impact painful scenarios onto the sensational body, and sometimes even the psyche, to elicit pleasure and to transmute the stories that we have around pain from suffering to expansion or healing. I've learned a lot by going into my pain and finding that it is wrapped in the sensual. So I've worked with a couple of clients on this. I recently had a client who explained this to me as one of the great benefits of our work together was that she learned that her fear and her grief and her pain were actually wrapped in a sensual knowing. And she was able to really be with those aspects of her sensory experience in a, I wouldn't say like it felt good, but it felt pleasurable, because pleasure doesn't always necessarily equate to feeling good, which is something that I think is a misconception around like the work I do. Definitely, like people will be like, yeah, I'm going to work with Kayla and I'm just gonna like feel good. It's like, well, actually, we're going to feel all the feelings. I'm actually going to expand the spectrum of your emotional capacity and sensorial capacity by saying all of that gets to be wrapped inside of the sensual nature. So I had this experience probably about 5 years ago in Costa Rica. I was having a deep grief. I was in a deep grief portal. And I was just allowing myself to completely release into it. Like I was not resisting like the pain, essentially. And so I went super into the pain and I just let it rush through me, like just completely like released into it. As my tears were coming down my face, I mean, it was tears and snot and everything. I mean, it was like a full-fledged thing. As that was happening, there was this moment of like awakened consciousness where I came to, and all the tears and snot that were dripping down my face and neck became this like incredibly pleasurable, almost orgasmic moment where I crossed a threshold in my capacity to be with the pain, and it transcended into this moment of erotic bliss. And I started to have these energetic kind of like kundalini, like people call it kundalini rising, these like energetic orgasmic waves like rush over my body. And it was almost as if I was like taking my own medicine. You know what I mean? Like it was like the medicine had been released in that moment. And I was now sipping on the elixir of something much more potent than the elixir of like my narrative of suffering. Right. And it was potent. It was powerful.
Yeah, I love the way that you described that, and I do understand in my own way what you mean. Like just really letting go into the release, really just allowing myself to be moved naturally by a deeply emotional and even painful process. It's the holding back and like the rigidity that 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 keeps it from possibly being pleasurable. And I guess like I never really like thought of it fully in that way, but I'm really happy that I'm thinking about it like that now. I'm thinking about a year ago, I had a really deep emotional process and I was held so beautifully and I just cried for like, I don't know, maybe hours, same like snot and tears and it was like my mind, I was thinking like, okay, I should stop now, enough is, like this has been a lot, right? But there was like this natural gravity that just kept pulling me in. And now that we're talking about it in this way, it was pleasurable to just release, to just flow, to be a river, and to not hold it back. Like the amount of times I've held it back. So it's making me think that that pleasure, yeah, I get what you mean now by it's not always like good feelings or yeah, could you talk more about that? Like it's I don't really like the binary of good and bad.
Yes.
Could we kind of like dance around that a little bit more?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're dismantling all binaries over here. There's like we are- that is the intentionality here. Yeah, no, when we seep in the essence of our true love, our true love's bliss, there's no distinction of separation. There's no good or bad, right or wrong, you know, kind of the language can't even really come close to what I'm trying to go into here. Like it's really hard to even start to find words
Yeah.
for the context of pleasure in its birthright, so to say.
Mm,
And I do find it to be just one of the most powerful inheritances, because it does disrupt that shame process, like it obliterates shame and it obliterates guilt, and you just go into this unconditionally loving space where one gets to be free in complete expression without harm or violation, because we are actually holding accountability and responsibility in that moment for the brevity of what we're working with, and the sacredness of what we're working with.
mm,
And so, the shadow side of all of this is that binary thinking, shame, guilt, the perpetuation of kind of exiling the erotic and pleasure to the underworld, shadow depths, and like that's where it belongs. And there's a lot of conditioning around that. And in the release into yourself, you're basically saying no to that. Like you're like, no longer will I compartmentalize this animal, this anima, this
mm,
natural instinct that I have, that is wild. I mean, it's not tameable. That's the other aspect of our pleasure, is that we can't domesticate that
mm,
of ourselves. And
yeah.
that is cause for concern for people who haven't spent much time in wild nature. They don't really know constructs of how to behave, how to reside with respect and care for the land, for nature, right? And because of that miseducation, I think people really struggle with their own nature and their own wildness because they don't really have the skills or the conscious awareness around the preciousness of these gifts. They've been domesticated, so they don't know, you know.
Yeah. So, and this is really where the kind of activism part comes in, right? So it's like pleasure and deepening your capacity for wholesome, embodied, heartfelt, soulful pleasure over time is really it's an active disobedience to the power structures. It goes against the current of a society that prioritizes efficiency, productivity, standardization, control, containment.
Yes. Yeah. So Adrienne Marie Brown wrote a book called Pleasure Activism. Highly recommend it for everybody out there. And it's a collection of primarily queer and Black feminist literature, essays, poems, you name it. And one essay that is literally like, you know, the Bible of this work is Audre Lorde's essay, Uses of the Erotic as Power. And that essay by Audre Lorde that was written, I believe, in the 1970s really speaks to this part. So, yeah, I just want to acknowledge the beautiful Black women who came before me in the cultivation of this thread line of pleasure activism before I speak to it. So, in Uses of the Erotic as Power, Audre Lorde really speaks to this concept of you know, hiring the standard. So if someone can actualize deep states of satiation inside of their erotic knowing, inside of their pleasure tapestry, then that person now has a reference point for a standard of being that is much higher than probably other things that they've been participating in, right? So it's like, actually, if I can like reach this state of satisfaction and wholeness in this one area of my life, then I should have that in all the other areas of my life. And people start to their consciousness raises, right? Like it raises the bar of their overall awareness. And they're like, huh, actually, I've been like getting breadcrumbs over here. I've been taking breadcrumbs over here. Like, no, like I am deserving of a whole, of a holistic whole knowing. And it doesn't mean that now we're entitled to like everything that we want, right? It's not about like entitlement, but it is about appreciation. It's about wholeness. It's about integrity. It's about sustenance and regenerative qualities, as opposed to kind of scarcity, you know, just get what you can have, or like it could be worse. And you know, things like that keep people from their agency and their sovereignty. And then when they awaken to like, it could be better, it puts them in a completely different context of reality. And that reality is a context that was not, that was on purpose extracted from the context of a lot of our current systems and structures. Like to develop the working class model, to develop the capitalist model, the industrial model, you know, the systems would have to kind of put people in their place, so to say, so that they could become the working the working class, or the turning of that wheel had to come from a mass generator that was the people. And if people start to say or question that, right? If people start to question, well, why am I doing this? Or what does this make sense for me? Or does this really fulfill me? Like, do I really enjoy this? Right? If people start asking those questions, those systems no longer function. Right? Like they will dismantle. So
Yeah.
it is a great source of empowerment and a great source of revolution to step into one's satiated states, because then that becomes the baseline, the
Yeah.
state. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And the baseline doesn't necessarily mean like raising that standard doesn't necessarily mean getting more.
No.
I'm reading this book right now. It's really incredible. I think it's called The Wisdom of the Native Americans, and it's a bunch of quotes and some writings and some speeches from indigenous men. I think it's only men, indigenous men from like the 1800s, mid to late 1800s, and it was edited by, I think, Kent Nurburn. Anyway, something that struck me is at different points in the book, these native men are talking about they just don't understand why the white folks, the Americans, um, how they could live in cities and how they could live to work and how everything was based around selling goods and how everything was based around creating putting labels and prices on everything, and that life was oriented toward that attainment of goods that came through the sacrifice of your day to day of working as hard as you can so that you can have items. And I think this is interesting in the context of what we're talking about, because as far as I understand, the indigenous folks before colonization, their religion, so to say, or their spiritual orientation toward life was highly erotic. And I don't mean sexual, I mean oriented toward communion with the animate world. And I would say, as far as I understand, that pleasure was probably very present and deep and rich for them. And so, but they didn't have much, like, and they didn't want much. They didn't accumulate. They were always giving things away. That was one of the main judgments, as far as I can tell, about the Americans, is how much stuff they had. They would build their homes. Their homes would be 15 feet high and made of stones. They said, we build our homes with sticks and hides, and then we can tear them down and walk away with them. You know, it's this very humble way of living. And I'm connecting it now to is it because they were so erotically alive and so deeply steeped in pleasurable connection to each other in the natural world? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that the resource of our erotic nature is one that has been, kind of like sloughed off as fluff. You know, it's like, well, it's like kind of like a nice thing to have, but this is what you really need. Like you really need all the stuff. You really need, the houses and the cars and the accumulation. Like that's actually what's needed. And so I think, probably and I do think that also we over kind of romanticize history in some ways. So I'm trying not to do that either. Like, I also want to be very conscious that like we have some real amazing comforts in modernity that like I don't want to give up. So I'm really happy for like plumbing and heat and stuff like that.
It
So
does come at a cost, though, too, right?
comes at a cost. Yes.
Right. So the plumbing and the heat and the infrastructure comes at the cost of, well, where you are now, I know you're in Mexico City, right?
Yeah.
Mexico City used to be a massive lake, and it was actually connected to other water sources, and now what's there? No water,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, we have a massive water issue.
So the cost of so-called comfort, right,
Yes.
is that you're actually giving up life force for that. So I think it's just very complex, you know?
Very complex. And I'm definitely someone who has a practice of learning how to trust all of it. Like, I want to trust every single part of the puzzle in knowing that it's medicine to be transmuted somehow. So I think that that there is a way forward in understanding that we're taking everything with us in a way that owns the history of it, right? Like, doesn't dismiss any one part of the puzzle, for example. Like, it's like, when you're doing a puzzle and like you get to the end and you realize you're missing that one piece, it's so frustrating. Like, it's just like, oh, are you kidding me? Like, it just feels so incomplete, even though it's like one tiny little piece. And that, I think, is the messaging that I would like to relay, is that every single piece of our history matters. The good, the bad, the ugly, the whatever, like all of it matters in reconciling why we're here and what we're doing, and continuing to live life. So I think that there's a lot of, let's say, atonement, like spiritual atonement, that can happen in like forgiving and granting this like kind of acknowledgement and deep reverence for the mistakes that we've made, the lessons that we've had to learn the hard way. All of those things come into it for me, and having a lot of grace for humanity, I think, is what's needed. Like, it's to say, like, how do we come together, as opposed to like, how do we continue to separate or divide, right? So I don't want to ever, look in reflection and put blame on any one particular piece of the puzzle. But I do want to say that maybe some pieces need reshaping, or need to be found again, or need to be rediscovered in ways that allow us to connect deeper with a deep trust in what it is that we're here for. So I think that pleasure, again, is a very underutilized resource in this day and age. Like, we have sloughed it off. Whereas, indigenous cultures, or I would say more somatically attuned cultures, erotically attuned cultures, especially like African tribes, in Africa, like really like the dancing, the music, the heartbeat of the drum, like all of these aspects that elicit the Eros in us, get to be remembered and get to be practiced and get to be utilized in a place, from a place of like, this is resourcing me. I know so much of building a business, right? Like, I always forget that I'm like a business owner, but I'm starting to really incorporate that more and more as I become more somatically attuned, erotically attuned. I have like the resourcedness to participate in a kind of like binary, like mundane world where I'm like filing taxes and I'm like sending invoices, and I'm literally inside of this capitalist mainframe that I believe is dying, but is also still very much here, and very much the main agreement among humans of how we are to trade value inside of the system. So, I've found that Eros and pleasure have just added to my capacity to be with it all. And for that, I am so grateful. And what I love about pleasure and Eros is that it's accessible. Like it's you can access it because it comes from you. And so just teaching people how to do that just builds so much prosperity. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe could you define Eros for those who maybe don't really know what we're saying by that word?
Yeah. So one of the definitions is a Greek definition of Eros, and it is the personified love that's born from chaos.
Mm.
So digest that for a moment. The personified love that's born from chaos. So Eros is a form of love, and it's a form of love that takes on like a human form. It takes on a personified form, a personhood. And so it's a materialized, in my opinion, that's an embodied, materialized form of love that is born from chaos. And I think that last bit is really important because we need to understand the origins. When we are working with Eros, it typically originates from a place of instability or a place of unknown. It's not logical. And like when you were talking before about the chicken and the egg, it's not linear. It's simultaneous. So I really believe that the chicken and the egg appeared at the same time when we're talking about Eros. And they are parallel universes, right? Like, so there's this multi-dimensionality to the erotic that takes us away from having to know something for sure, and lends itself to the great mystery of life and allows us to love from that place of unknown and that place of chaos and that place of disruption, or that place of insecurity, or that place of shame, or that place of guilt, right? It really helps us operate from that context, from in a loving way. Yeah.
Yeah, that was really well said. So it's really like an embodied appreciation for the mystery of the creative forces of life that have given us life, that continue to give us life. And so the deepening into Eros and erotic nature then is a deepening into that word of the year, trust, as well, trusting that the creative forces of life are benevolent in a way, are here to companion us in our unfolding, in our evolution, in our becoming.
Yeah.
Is that why it's a healing force?
Yes, my dear.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. There's just such great such great beauty, and I think also in the sexual realm, like how it's personified through the practice of sacred sexuality is also something that is a thread line inside of the wide tapestry of the erotic, and to anchor in those energies, to ground those energies, to create heaven on earth, so to say, like to bring it down to earth. Through the sacred sexual is also like a great practice that I want to just lend words to, because it's a yes and, this whole conversation, I think we've been really good about saying that sex is a part of the entirety of the experience, and there's all aspects of how the erotic comes in. But if people are curious about the sexual part, like, yes, I'm here for that too.
Yeah. So like for me, sex and connecting through lovemaking has always been where I feel almost like where I can be like my fullest self. Because when it comes to words and expression through my voice, sometimes I feel clear, coherent. Many times I don't feel like words escape me, but my body and movement and sensation has always been for me an easier way into feeling the truth of the moment. And so then in connecting with another, movement, somatic, felt sense experience is also that as well. And then, of course, the immense pleasure that can come with it too, when you really learn how to move with someone in a good way. So that's usually where I feel like most just like true, clear, coherent, even like present. So in that way, it's really healing because I feel more whole, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. There's some old texts and manuscripts that speak to the sacred sexual priestesses that used to reside kind of in like Mesopotamia area, right? I think that's where some of the temples were. And though I will also say that Eros in its definition is a feminine energy. So it's a feminine source of power. And the priestesses, the embodied priestesses would hold that feminine source. Now, I don't know if it probably wasn't as gendered as maybe our modern day culture would like to think it was. So I like to think that, the priestesshood was filled with tons of femme folk, whether they were biologically male or female. I don't think that really mattered. But these priestesses would basically, they were sacred sexual healers. And when the warriors would come back from war, they would stop at the temple first before returning home. And these healers and curanderas, these mystical, beautiful brujas, witches, however you want to call it, would take care of them for several days, feed them nourishing soups and fruits, and lather them in oils, and sing songs and elicit sexual play and experience, and really soothe their nervous systems from the traumas of war, and then would send them back out and back to their families after maybe being there for 5 to 7 days or something like this, is kind of what I've heard. And they would go back to their families renewed and available for the reception of their homecoming. Whereas if we just come back from these painful, traumatic places and we just go straight back into life, right? Like, as we know now with all the trauma research and development in that area, that we are harboring calcifications in our body that harbor trauma and can recapitulate or sabotage certain aspects of our intimate relating, of our the sustainability of our communities, and our relationships to one another are really impacted when we have unresolved traumas. And so what I also love about sex is that, yes, it is healing because it helps us to dissolve some of these calcifications that we harbor inside of ourselves from real fucked up shit. I don't know if I can curse on this.
Fuck yeah.
Real fucked up shit that happens and is like real and has real impact. And You know, this is one modality. I'm not saying that sexual healing is the only modality to trauma healing. I'm just saying that it is a modality. It's a legit modality that should be welcomed, you know, if that's what people choose. You know, there's tons of other ways that we can heal trauma, you know, don't get me wrong. And there is this gift, this offering that we have to utilize sex in a very sacred way.
It makes me sad to think about how many cultures around the world and communities around the world that are particularly suffering at this time and have suffered in the past, who aren't connected sexually, as far as I understand, that sexuality is even condemned, you know, certain religious orientations, and then to see how much pain there is in those communities, and to know like you're condemning maybe the very thing that could actually help your community and people heal and become more whole and move forward in a good way. Have you read, do you know Starhawk, the author and activist? No? Okay, she wrote quite a famous book I think in the 90s called The Fifth Sacred Thing. It's a novel. It's really, really great. And then she wrote the sequel like a couple decades later, and it's called City of Refuge. Also really great. One of the things she explores in that book is, in the first book, it's like a utopian versus dystopian society is kind of the tension that happens. It's like the United States falls apart, the global connection of like internet and stuff falls apart for some reason. You don't really know why, but there's like a dystopian society in the south of the US, and in the north, and particularly in Northern California, there's a group of people who really are able to create like a kind of a utopian type lifestyle. And they're coming to be overrun by the South for different reasons. And anyway, the end of the book ends with the Northerners kind of winning this battle. But there's all these soldiers left over from the South. And these soldiers have been, their whole life has been about being soldiers, killing, raping, being tortured, like just all the bad things, right? And now these Northerner folks have the kind of the responsibility of integrating and healing these soldiers. And so in the second book, she explores how they did this. And one of the main ways in which they did that was to send these men to a sacred sexuality goddess healing temple. That was like really the most important and crucial way to bring them back into their bodies, into respecting women and Eros, and understanding themselves better. And I don't know if she explores that in that book, but what I'm thinking now is not only for healing pain and trauma and whatnot, but also for young people and young men. Like how different things would be if young men were able to experience these kinds of sacred sexuality healing temples, and to be shown the way through mature embodied women priestesses who knew the way, you know. Yeah, I'm just imagining that things would be a lot different.
Oh, yeah.
Well, my life would have been a lot different if that was the case. Yeah.
Definitely. I always say, I'm like, if we had embodied leaders, you know, running the show, it would be a very different show, you know. And sacred sexuality work brings people into their bodies, brings people into right relationship to their somatic experience with quite sensorial, like high capacity emotion and sensation. And when someone has practice in holding and anchoring aspects of their sensorial body that are super intense, they have a way better ability to anchor into super intense moments
Mm.
where there's crisis unfolding, or where there's a big decision that has to be made, and they have just much better access to their prefrontal cortex because they've practiced
Mm.
how to keep that on while in heightened states of sensation.
Mm.
And I think that that is a great leadership skill, to be honest. I'm like, that to me is leadership. It's true leadership is when someone can stay grounded and not get lost in the chaos of what's happening around them. Again,
Mm.
Eros, born from chaos. And so if we're willing to go to the origin of our erotic nature and really work with it, then I think we have much better capacity to be with the unpredictable and the nature of this wild world that we're
Mm.
in. We can navigate it that much better.
Yeah, and to craft beauty from it too. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, to not be afraid of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, coming into the end of this particular conversation, let's talk for a moment about heart tending. And I'd love to just hear you talk about this transformative process of um, conditional love really beginning to dissolve and untangle so that the heart can move into a more unconditional space. How are you understanding that process now, and yeah, what feels important to speak to around that?
Yeah. Heartbreak, heartbreak is a medicine. And I'm sure most people who will listen to this have had their hearts broken, and probably broken open many times. And it happens relatively young, like there's many moments I see even children, their hearts are just broken because they didn't get, something that they wanted, or, something, right? So this generative power, where grief comes in, grief is really a partner to Eros. They work together quite beautifully, and they kind of weave in and out of each other. But the heart has, I think, come here for the capacity for love, and like, how do we bring loving experience and loving context into the world through that heart space. And I've found that the more willing I am to let my heart break, the larger my capacity becomes to allow love in. So I've had to really decondition myself around, God, so many things, like expectations, expectations of other people, myself, like, and I think that the prescript of the nuclear family has, taken us away from the breadth of our heart's capacity in so many ways, and really limited us to this kind of concept that, like, we only share our hearts with, like, our most, like, closest and nearest people, and those are the people that we fight for, and those are the people that we deem worthy of our love, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that it's left a lot of vulnerability, where we see wars and climate change and all of these things happening around the globe. And a lot of people can't even connect to that. Like, they don't even have a resource in their hearts to even have any emotion around it. And so I think that has come at a great failing to humanity, for us to have prescribed such a tiny box for our hearts. Now, I think most people know this, whether they're conscious of it or not. Their hearts know this sadness, this loss of our human species that has become so cut off from each other. and so desensitized. And so when I meet people, what tends to happen is that there's some sort of longing that is revealed in their heart for a much deeper connection to humanity. Now, at first, that longing might just be about another person that they care for, right? It might be like, oh, I really want to reconnect and deepen my partnership. And that is a beautiful place to start within your beloved partnerships and your trusted allies, right? And so I help people to kind of unravel those spaces first, and really understand this tender longing gets to be met, that they get to be met, that they get to be nourished, that they get to be held in so many ways unimagined. And so it really opens up kind of the vision for people. They become way wider in their expression of loving. And then that starts to go out into the world, and then it starts to go out into their communities, and then it starts to go beyond their, their borders and into the animals and the species of the ocean and the people halfway across the world on the other side of the planet that are sleeping right now while we're awake having this conversation. And we start to reconnect these lines of thought, these heart lines, so to say. We start to reconnect that woven root system, that tapestry that connects all of us really through the heart and through the loving space. So yeah, it's a deconditioning of the ways in which we've said, oh, I have to hide or diminish or make smaller in order to be loved. I'm saying the opposite, that you have to come out, that you need to express, and that you need to be seen in order to expand your capacity to love, and therefore grant others permission to be received by you. So it's this real regenerative process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the root words of courage mean to be with heart, to live with heart. So it's courageous, to love another, even because it calls a lot forth from us. But then to expand that beyond just a lover or a family into a greater community, and maybe even to encompass the living earth, that's a really courageous act, because you're going to meet a lot of parts of yourself that need to mature, that need to grow, that need to be refined in order to meet that depth of that a love for a greater community really calls from us. So yeah, it's a courageous act. But the conditions and the stories that we've taken on around what love means and who we're supposed to love and how, it takes a lot to really begin to dismantle all of that. And I know in my own life, in my experience, I'm continuously meeting stories and imposed boundaries or walls or protective mechanisms. But the thing is every time I am able to expand a little bit further out, I recognize how not only essential it is, but how beautiful it is too, and how natural it feels. So yeah, you're reminding me of how Ram Dass, also a great spiritual teacher, he would say that too. He'd say, just start with someone you love, and love them fully. And then just play with the idea of that love expanding a bit beyond them, and just start to radiate out from there. Yeah.
It starts with us, like it really does. And what we're looking for is literally been here this whole entire time, like it's in you. It's what we long for resides inside of our own knowing. And so I just help people kind of unveil that for themselves so that they can see themselves more clearly, so that they can show up in integrity and truth and power, and that translates to loving action, and then that sort of let's say self-awareness really helps them anchor and hold the love through the mess of it all. Because I don't, in any of this conversation, want to make any of this sound like utopia, even though I love utopic ideas. It is not utopic. It is devastatingly tragic in many, many ways. Like, there will be revelations that are very messy, very messy and very vulnerable. And guess what? You get to be loved through that too. There gets to be a love for the parts of yourself that will always be ugly, will always be dark, or whatever you want to call it, right? Will always reside in this place of like fuckery. Like, there, I don't think any of that is going anywhere anytime soon. I don't think that we're going to be like, transformed into angels, but like there are living angels, right? Like, so it's almost this both and. It's like this ability to hold all of it, this ability to be with this growing capacity for life. And, I'm honored. All of my clients are just so incredible because the revealing that happens inside of the container is so loving. That's my biggest thing. It's like, we're going to practice unconditional love in this space, which means that like there's going to be times where you don't like me and I don't like you, and like we disagree, and we're going to have to learn how to love each other through that. And we're going to use the erotic, and we're going to use pleasure as a solve for those moments when we just want to like strangle each other. But instead, we're going to laugh, or we're going to find humor, or we're going to find a place of playfulness inside of it so that we can get through this together, because that's actually the most important thing. I think that righteousness has a place and is justified. And then there's moments where we have to surrender and we have to release into an unknown space with people. And it is fucking scary. But you know what? I think we can do it. I really do. I think we have that capacity.
I know we do. Yeah. Thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate it. This has been a beautiful conversation. I feel like I'm seeing myself more clearly, and I'm deeply appreciative of your knowledge, your wisdom, your sharing, your voice and expression. Is there anything you want to share with folks to tie everything together? Direct them toward anything in specific? I'll put all relevant links to your work in the show notes, but you can finish the conversation with a message of some kind if you want.
Yeah, I just invite people to follow their heart's longing and to be curious about that, because it will lead you, I think, to the truth of yourself and this precious life that you've been given. Such a gift. And if there's any longing or sparks of tender heart palpitations, feel free to reach out to me. I'm totally available to get on a call and have a conversation. I have openings in my calendar and all that stuff, and the links will be in here. So please don't be shy. Like, I am a human. The internet is weird, like it can be kind of like, right? But it's like, I'm a human. There's no tax on reaching out to me. Yeah.